Some of you may remember that we gave some talks about Norwegian stave churches about 6 years ago. And these were all based on a research trip that we did in 2014. Here we are at Gul, or rather I should say at Bygdøy in the center of Oslo. And for those of you who can do so, it is free entrance if you are in Viking costume, hence Catherine's garb. Now, we went on this trip armed with photographic permits from the Norwegian Ministry of Culture and had made special arrangements to see some churches that were not open to the public. What I didn't know then was that this was towards the end of a 10-year programme by the Ministry of Culture to restore all 28 stave churches in Norway at a cost of about £15 million. And although it wasn't an objective of this work, it was hoped that an outcome would be to encourage fresh academic research involving stave churches. I found, however, that my photographic permits and so on were not always recognised in the individual locations. But fortunately, I also had one other document with me, which proved invaluable on several occasions. But before we go any further, I think that a historical timeline might be helpful. Starting with the Lindisfarne raid in 793, the declaration of Norway being a Christian country at 1024, the murder of Thomas à Becket features in not so much this week, but more next week, the Anglo-Norse Treaty of 1217, which was the first free trade agreement in the world and established free movement of labour between Norway and the Kingdom of England and tariff-free transit of valuable goods. A couple of other important dates: the Grue Stave Church fire in 1822, and in 1851, the Church Act in Norway, which required 30% of the population of the parish to be able to be seated in the church. And I've overlaid on this the approximate rate of building of churches in Norway, which can be deduced from the written and the archaeological record. Wooden churches are shown in blue at the top and stone in brown down below. And I've ringed in the red on the blue the time when stave churches were actually being built. Now, what thoughts does the term stave church evoke in you? Well, what we think today owes an awful lot to the work of Lawrence Dietrichson, who was the first professor of art history in Norway, who published a study of stave churches and their architecture in 1889. He maintained that the stave churches originated and developed in Norway based on cult buildings from pre-Christian times. These in turn were inspired by and built upon the pattern of wooden churches in the British Isles, brought back by Vikings sailing home from raids to the west. There was a certain Nordic nationalism at play, I suspect. But there was, and still is, scant evidence of any link between cult and Christian architecture in Scandinavia. But I quote from Dietrichson: "Should these buildings, rising bravely out of mountainous nature, contain nothing created by the people themselves, in harmony with the climate and the national customs they were to serve? It was the people, the nation, which built and mastered the materials, the wood, in ways no one else could. Viking ships, stave churches, and wood carvings were viewed as a national characteristic, where the wood carving tradition was a particular talent of the Norwegian peasant, an interpretation with roots far back in time. Dietrichson's views have heavily influenced thinking about stave churches the past 120 years. But the perceived view of pre-Christian cult buildings, the Hofs, as the starting point for the stave churches was criticised at the time for its flimsy basis in sources at the time, but it struck a chord with both laymen and scholars. But I quote from a PhD thesis which has just been published by Durham University. History and cultural conditions have played an important role in stave church survival and interpretation. The romantic view that stave church decoration preserves pre-Christian thematic material is a misinterpretation of Romantic and Gothic influences. At the time of the building of these structures, animal and human heads, as well as dragon imagery, were common and interpreted in a Christian milieu. Now, the term stave church itself refers to the way that the church was built. Stave construction is a method of building with posts, staves, as the load-bearing elements. The Norwegian word for stave churches is stavkirke, and it derives from the Old Norse staffa, the term meaning a pillar or post. The vertical posts, and you can see these vertical posts here as we're looking up towards the roof in Gul Stave Church in Oslo. Note in particular the corners here, these angle brackets, which are strengthened with wood made from the transition between a tree's roots and its trunk, where the fibers are strong and bent at an angle. And outside, most stave churches are roofed with wooden shingles. Here, while I'm talking about roofs, I just want to have a quick look at the roof trusses in Holtdalen Stave Church, which are ingeniously designed to limit the outward forces at the top of the walls. The forces which caused so many medieval stonemasons to put in buttresses in churches across Europe. But here, the moment the bottom of the church, of the roof starts to push out, it's actually stopped by these beams in the middle. So, types of wooden construction. The earliest sort of wooden construction that we see in Norway is what's known as palisade work, where all the upright members are structural and load-bearing. They may be embedded in the ground or in a sill. And here I want to make a short diversion, actually, to St Andrew in Greenstead, Essex. This is said to be the oldest wooden church in Europe. There are 51 timber planks here, which date from about 1060, although excavations in the chancel in 1960 revealed the existence of two earlier timber structures dating from the 6th and the 7th centuries. That's about the time that St Ced was beginning his work of converting the Saxons to Christianity. In 1848 to 9, the church underwent severe restoration works. Here you can see the brickwork at the bottom. They lifted the sill. And inside, I'm just looking here, you can still see the medieval woodworking marks on the timbers. Now, recent work has actually established that some of these timbers aren't from 1060, but actually from 845. It's an incredible age. But we go back to Norway. And here, after palisade construction, we started to see what's termed as post construction, where you had structural corner posts embedded in the ground. Now the walls are no longer load-bearing, but they are embedded in a horizontal sill. And then we move to stave construction, where the structural posts themselves are no longer embedded in the ground, but they are actually also raised on the sill. And then the final method of wooden church construction that we see, and this started after the Black Death, is that instead all the wooden elements are laid horizontally rather than vertically. And the big advantage of the log construction is that a building only needs 2 people to build it. Whereas the stave construction, as you'll see later, needs a lot more people. So let's just have a quick look at the way that the frames actually come together. So you can see how in some, you've got the staves themselves meeting the horizontal sills, and the horizontal sills themselves have a cog joint so that they are very, very firmly fixed. Now, following Dietrichson's classification of the architecture of stave churches, some were what he called the simple type, where you effectively just had 4 corner posts. Then there is the Mura type. There's actually only 3 examples in a limited area where you have got some external buttressing. Then there is a type known as the mid-mast, where you have a central post supporting a belfry. And finally, you have a raised central room, which Dietrichson often referred to as being the basilica style of building. And note in particular the ambulatory space around the central room. So here I'm looking at a plan of Holtdalen, where there are actually 6 staves, 4 on the nave and 2 more in the chancel. And then to Uvdal Stave Church, this is a central mast one, where you can see the central stave there, which goes right up to a magnificent belfry. And then Borgund. This is often taken as being the archetypal Norwegian stave church. And one of the things to note particularly is this area around the outside, which in Norwegian is termed the Svalgang. It's normally translated simply as a covered balcony or vestibule, but there are shades of meaning there. Sval means hall, but the term gang implies movement. The gang is very similar to the sort of the English term gate. It suggests a place for walking. And gangdag is the ecclesiastical term for a processional day. And I also note that all the churches which have this sort of external ambulatory are locations where there is normally deep snow at Easter time. So here we have a map showing where these different types of stave churches are to be found. You've got the Mura type just up in that little group up there to the north. But another feature of the wooden stave church building is that it is relatively easy to transport. It is the original IKEA flat pack. There are 5 churches that have moved, which I'm actually going to be referring today, where the ring shows the current location and the arrow points back to the original. We've got Gul, we've got Fortun, we've got Holtdalen, we've got Garmo, and we've got Øya. And then finally, one which moved all the way to Poland from Van. Now, I can only think of 2 examples of stone churches in England which have moved, one at Perranporth and the other very close to us here at Stonegrave. I referred to post-construction, and we do know of some sites where there were post-constructed churches in Norway. Some where there is no later church building on top of it, and others where the post church has actually been found underneath a stave church. But what I find absolutely amazing is how many lost stave churches there are. We now know that there were around 1,000 actually built in Norway. 28 remain, which represents just over 2%. In the 1850s, there were still about 50 stave churches standing. Now remember the Church Act of 1851, and this actually triggered a massive demolition of the remaining stave churches because they were too small. They couldn't hold 30% of the population of the parish. So at this time, a number of the churches were just torn down. Fortunately, some had been measured up beforehand. There's another point about wooden buildings is that they are risky, as seen in the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, when Norway was declared a Christian country in 1024, one of the first laws that was passed was that a new church must be dedicated within 12 months of the destruction of the old. Now, you don't pass such laws unless you expect them to be needed. I suspect that not only was the burning of farmsteads a common occurrence during the conversion of to Christianity in places where people were resisting the new white Christ, but that retaliatory burning down of churches was also common. Which brings us to our next moved church, and a sad story. Here we're looking at Fortune Church, which is now at Fantoft, just outside Bergen. But here I've got a photograph of it in Luster before it was moved in 1873. It was dismantled in 1883 and then rebuilt at Fantoft near Bergen. But just note the form of the tower belfry and the plain roof that you actually have. Here, I've got a recolored photo from 1890, shortly after it was re-erected. And I think actually reimagined might be a better word. You can clearly see the influence of Dietrichson and his views on Norsk, the Norwegian architectural form, on the way that the church was rebuilt. But here we see it shortly after an arson attack on Whit Sunday, 1992. This was the first of a string of church burnings in Norway, when 2 years later, a guy was convicted of burning Åsane and Stortveit churches in Bergen, close by, and also 2 other churches elsewhere in Norway. However, the church has risen again, thanks to the meticulous drawings which were taken when the church was first rebuilt at Fantoft. Although it did take 5 years, not the statutory 12 months to rebuild the church. Now, the worst building fire disaster in Norway also happened on a Whit Sunday. This was in 1822, 170 years earlier. Grue Church was entirely wooden construction, originally a stave church which had been rebuilt about 1600 with the addition of 2 transepts. And in the transepts were wide galleries, allowing the church to accommodate up to 700 people. Unfortunately, the doors to the church all swung inwards. The exterior of the building was covered with pine tar, and subsequent calculations had shown that over 17 tons of tar had been applied to the church in the 200 years before the fire. The north door itself blocked the exit for people descending from the north gallery. In the panic, all the church doors got jammed shut, and at least 113 people died in the fire, although their remains just fitted into 5 coffins, which were buried under the altar in the rebuilt church. It's notable that since then, all doors in public buildings in Norway must open outwards, and a number of stave churches have had their doors butchered as a result. Now, I want to look at materials and techniques for a bit. Ideally, the wood for building a church was felled in the waning phase of the moon between October and January. This was the time of the year and the time of the month when there was the least sap to be found in the trees, meaning that the timbers were actually going to be more resistant to rot. And sometimes trees were trained and pruned into the required shape. And here you can actually see a tree which looks as if it has been trained in the past. Shipbuilders also use this a lot to be able to get the stern posts for the keel and things like that. Here I've got some sketches taken from medieval manuscripts showing workers at work, trimming a beam, cleaving timber, sawing planks, and a section from stained glass in Chartres, where workers work on something which looks very much like the center wall, the center room wall in a Stave Church. And that there is a picture of the glass itself. Whoopsie. Here are some of the tools which would have been used. These are replica Viking Age tools from a museum in Denmark. And the way that they were used, you were going to be splitting logs. And here, 2015, we're actually looking at the starting point for creating roof shingles for re-roofing the Holtdalen Stave Church. And you can see the way that the surface of the wood shows clearly the split marks. Now, splitting a log, if the log is straight, you get a good clean break. If the trunk is twisted, you have problems. However, a twist there actually gives extra strength, which meant that twisted trunks were often specifically selected as the staves for the uprights in stave churches. Once you can get quite a decorative finish on the logs simply by working with an axe. Here I'm working with a telemark style broad axe, and you've got two different sorts of markings there formed by different axes. Here, again, in the roof of Holtdalen Stave Church, these herringbone marks that you've actually got here are a clear indication not of one person, but two people working in concert as they were trimming the wood down. Making planks, you use a slightly different shaped axe, a planking axe, which has a slightly offset head. And then the final smoothing, here you can see the side light really picks out the way that the spoke shave here can actually give you, the final wooden shape gives you a great indication as to how it's been worked. For planking, you need to get rid of the round side, and it's finally finished off with a shave. Now, more recently, sawmills, and these produce a totally different texture to the surface of the wood. Borgund Church has a belfry, and this is how we saw the belfry in 2005. The lower parts of the bell tower large parts of the bell tower of medieval. But the Stave Church Preservation Programme showed in the following year, this is a photograph from 2006, that the uprights in the bell tower were severely rotted. They decided, rather than trying to repair, that they would actually replace all the staves, the rotten staves, in situ. And here you've got a picture of them working on some of the replacement staves, which are now in position a year later in 2006. And here we see the bell tower as it was on our road trip in 2014. Going back to the roof of the church, this was how we saw it in 2004, before the restoration work started. And it's remarkable that the tower, this is original from 1180. Some of the shingles, even in 2004, they think dated back to the original roof. So here's some work in progress on repairing on restoring the roof in 2011. They started out by doing a very small test area. And this is a guy who's actually shaping the roofing shingles. And finally, when we got back there in 2014, just notice how much darker the church building is compared with our photograph of the pre-restoration, when it was really a very, very light brown when we were looking at that top area there and at the dragon's heads. Freshly tarred. One of the other churches that we visited in 2014, Ringebu, was in the midst of re-roofing. And inside they were selling off old shingles as a fundraiser. And it was pot luck as to whether you got a sawn shingle, which dated from maybe the 18th or the 19th century, or whether you got an early medieval axe-shaped, axe-hewn shingle. Unfortunately, on the day that we were there, they only had sawn shingles available. And here I'm just looking at a few of the tools which have been excavated. Draw knife from Viking York, that's from the plane, and a modern copy of what the plane would have looked like. Now, how were the churches erected? You started out with timber frames which were laid on the ground and then gradually erected, pulled vertical. And you can see straight away that you cannot do this sort of thing with just two people. Here, experimental archaeologists at work in 2008, and you've got Lom Stave Church there in the background. I'm going to return to Lom next week. Just a few details of the way that the staves, the uprights, fit into the horizontal sills. So I'm looking here at Bringebu Stave Church, the one where they were doing the roof when we got there. Haltdalen, that we've already seen before. And here, Eidsborg, you can actually see very clearly how they've got a twisted upright, which adds to the strength. And looking here at a peg joint between the stave and the sill in Lom Church, and you can see in this drawing here how you've just got a little bit of flexibility, so you can drop the stave into the sill. Another church, we found some emergency repairs, and just note the green man that you have got on the stave there at Höre Stave Church. Another one, this is Myhogan. Well, it's now at Myhogan. This is the former Garmo Stave Church, another one which has moved. And here, just note how you've got vertical planking on the nave, but the transepts, which were added in the 17th century, have got horizontal log planking. Remember the mason's floors from Catherine's talk? Well, here at Torpo, we've got a sketch on the wall plank in the upper part of the nave, which seems to be a part of the design for the carvings on the south door. And again, I'll be looking rather more at Torpo Church next week. And here, a school project about 10 years ago was to rebuild or to build a small stave church. And here you can see the processes they went through in producing some of the decorative work. Højord, another church that we went to in 2014. Fortunately, the wraps had been taken off by the time we got there. It was spanking new, fresh tar and new copper. And a warning notice as you came in, which said for the next 6 months, the tar is still going to be wet. And how did they make the tar? Well, here actually we've got a picture of making the tar used to waterproof and preserve the wood in the stave churches being made in the traditional way at Avaldsnes. This was being done by a group of Viking reenactors. Right, so I'm now going to turn to the first of the stave churches that I really want to look at today. Urness. This is the only stave church which is a World Heritage Site, and it's been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1979. Dendrochronology has shown that some of the timbers that were used in building this current church were felled in 1129. First of all, this was how it looked in 2005, the first time we got to Urness, before any of the restoration work had started. Since 2015, a multidisciplinary research group from all over Europe and the United States has been looking at Urness Stave Church. Until then, they said that Norwegian stave churches simply had not been on the European academic research agenda. And for the first time, we've actually got a multidisciplinary research team working together who have got experience from outside of Norway, looking at iconography, manuscripts, and the liturgy. And they published their first research paper just over a year ago. It makes fascinating reading. Now, the preservation work actually started here in 2007. But before they started the work, I got this beautiful late spring light picture, which picks out the details on the north wall here, one of the real wonders of this church. However, over a long time, the church had suffered stability problems, especially on the north side. There was drainage issues, they thought, down there. And when they started the restoration project in 2007, they found that the sill supporting that north wall there was 12 centimeters lower than the southern one. And this was now influencing the whole load bearing within the church. And there was a distinct worry that that sill itself would end up being cracked. It was also rotting because it had come into contact with the earth. However, not all the subsidence in the church was simply due to problems on the north side there. During the history of the church, 2 of the supporting staves had also been removed and cross braces put in. But they did some investigations underneath the floor, and it showed that the foundations were not as strong and as stable as they could be. There had been excavation work in 1950 to explore underneath the church, and they don't think that when they put things back, they did it as well as they could have done. So they decided that they would actually need to jack up the north side and put in much more substantial foundations. They straightened the turret of the church and various other things as well. And they also took down the Calgary group there for renovation work while all of this was being done inside the church. So here we've got a before and after pair of pictures of the work on the north side. But this was how it looked when we approached by ferry in 2014. You've got the church up there. Note the farmstead close by, which has been occupied by the same family for over 1,000 years. And down here is where the ferry comes in and where you have to park the car. So it's about a kilometre walk up the hill to get to the church itself. Now, For a long time, it was thought that this was the third church on the site. The recent research work has actually shown that this is the fourth church on this site, the oldest one dating back to about 950, which was then replaced around about 1000. And these were both of post, not stave construction. Then in about 1070, a more simple form of stave church was put up here. And here we've got some drawings showing the current stave church, and in the brown shading, you've got the timbers, which they know were reused from the earlier 1070 stave church. And here I've got a drawing which shows a possible reconstruction of what that earlier stave church actually looked like. And also a fairly early drawing, 1834, by Johann Christian Dahl, who was one of the people who was very, very influential in saving the stave churches for posterity. So I'm now looking on the north wall, where what we've got here is actually the portal from the earlier 1070 church. And I've just sort of overlaid on there the drawing from it. You've got a standing animal here with a mane entwined and being attacked by serpents of various kinds. This portal has often been regarded as pagan iconography, but the latest research says that this is completely wrong. Several of the serpents entwining and attacking the big lion on the portal are transformed into lilies. And just look at the tails there, how you've actually got lilies coming out of them. The animal is a stylized lion, a central motif in the heraldry of the late Viking Age. It's also a symbol of the ruler and can symbolize Christ, who is struggling against evil forces. And through studying the liturgy, the portal's original religious context, the research paper shows how the door is the place where the man shall acknowledge Christ. Psalm 24 was sung here, for example, and it reveals how the true king is linked to the portal, imposing the question, who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory. And you'll remember I was talking about the use of Psalm 24 when I was talking about music and processions last year, no, 2 years ago now. But the portal here is actually reminiscent of the Celtic Christian symbolism of having the head of Christ between the mouths of two beasts. And here we've got a little bit more detail, and just notice how the deeply incised woodwork, clearly influenced by metalwork. One of the researchers who was focusing on Irish material, where the Ernest style is actually an important decoration in manuscripts and on metal artwork. She shows how significant the Ernest style was in a form of expression in an area that stretched from Gotland in the Baltic Sea to right across Ireland. A little bit higher detail. No woodworker would carve a fine bit like that unless they were wanting to imitate metalwork. But now I want to move inside into the interior and the fine staves that you've got here, and very, very different weathering of the wood once you're away from the external influence of the rain. Oopsie. These, the tops of these staves, and this one here is actually the symbol which was used to portray the Ministry of Culture at the time that I got all my photographic permits. But the dragon, often portrayed in modern times as representing the pre-Christian Nordic era, but the latest research says that this is completely wrong. One of the experts on Romanesque manuscripts shows how the dragon not only appears in Ernest Church here around 1130, but also on the portal of Hopperstad Stave Church in the same area, And these show a striking resemblance to the fighting dragons found in manuscripts in the Canterbury School between 1070 and 1120. And here, from the British Library digitized manuscripts, just look at these lovely dragons. Elsewhere in the manuscript, there are two men pulling their beards, a motif that may indicate self-control, an important element in attaining salvation. And that pulling of beards motif is also found on one of the Ernest's staves. And here are some other stylistically similar carvings found in stonework in English churches. So St Albans in Derby, Breedon on the Hill, Burnholme, Gainford, Folkestone, and York Minster. So here we're looking at the interior, and you can see how you've got some cross bracing which was put in when they truncated the staves which were there. Whoopsie, wrong way. And I love the decoration on the foot of that truncated stave. But note the rood group up above. This so-called Calvary group is from the 1100s and is the oldest such sculptured group in Norway. Given that the figure of Christ has not been repainted and that the two figures representing Mary and St. John were repainted for the last time in the 1200s, this really is quite something unique. The Calvary group hangs between 5 and 7 meters above the floor on the east wall of the nave, and normally it is very, very difficult to see in the dim interior of the church. It is known to have been treated once before in 1957 when it was cleaned and conserved, and large amounts of flaking paint were camouflaged by retouching. And in 2001, it was also given a protective varnish clothing. But even though some of the colours and gilding are missing, the colours have partly changed, mainly darkened, and metal foils have oxidised. It's still magnificently well preserved, but it's hard to imagine how it must have looked 800 to 900 years ago. So here I have got a digital reconstruction showing done using a careful analysis of the wood, the chalk, the pigments, binding agents, and so on, of how they think that it actually was. The three figures, Christ, Mary, and John, are all carved in alder, whereas the cross is made of aspen. Both of those were woods which were native to Norway in the 1100s. It indicates that sculptures may have been carved locally, but they were primed with chalk, and isotope analysis shows that the chalk has come from the south coast of England, which indicates that the sculptures, if indeed they were made in Norway, may well have been made on the west coast close to the sea routes rather than actually on site in Ørnes. So I'm just absolutely bowled over by this. One of the other treasures of the church, which sadly is no longer in the church, but in the Bergen Museum, this stunning carving of St. Sunniva. And one of the other church treasures, normally in the museum in Bergen, but these have been returned to the church for a few special occasions. These are candlesticks from Limoges about 1220. Now, I asked you earlier to remember about the Anglo-Norse Treaty of 1217, whose 800th anniversary, unfortunately, we missed celebrating. And at that time, Limoges was part of the English Kingdom of France, which meant that the Anglo-Norse Treaty meant that these could come all the way from Limoges to Ørnes without any import taxes. Here we're looking at the chancel. Altarpiece itself is dated about 1700, but the Apostles' Creed on the walls behind was dated 1601 when the chancel itself was extended. And just note, that's not a collection plate, that is the font, it's a brass font. And here you have what's often called the bishop's chair, a medieval chair for the priest to sit in while he was hearing confessions. Another look back up at the stave, and just look at the wonderful decoration that they also have above there. But the very, very small windows, which were the only source of light inside the building. And here, more recently, the ceiling has been panelled in, but you can see they've left a bit, they've uncovered a bit again, so you can see some of the original structure of the church. And here, lovely carving to the ends of the pews, and the 18th century squire's pew, where the inhabitants of that farmstead were, they were the patrons of the church, and that would be where they worshipped. Turn round and look towards the west, and you've got another box-like area. That actually was the women's pew for women who were unclean, either they were coming for churching after giving birth, or they were pregnant. But pre-Reformation, such women were not allowed inside the church at all. Beautiful medieval chandelier. And the door. What a lock. And you can see on the wood there, the raised area where there had been another lock face which protected the wood from weathering. And here was the wonderful guide who did not recognize the Ministry of Culture photographic permits and said very firmly, no photography whatsoever. And then I produced my Cambridge University reader's card. And she said, ah, you really are an academic. She locked the church so that nobody else could come in and see, while we were locked inside, how we were taking photographs in the forbidden area. She really must have had the church in her DNA, because she lived on the farm. So it would have been her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, perhaps, who was one of the most influential people in Norway in the 900s, when the first church was actually built on the site here. Now, Ernest Church itself doesn't have a belfry by it. Up here is where the church belfry used to be. And just looking back down from the belfry site onto the church, much, much better weather compared with our first visit in 2005. Now, I want to go back and look a little bit more at Holtdalen Church, because this is another one which has been IKEA flat pack moved several times. Here is Holtdalen with the new church, which was built to replace the old before the old was taken down and moved and reimagined to the university at Trondheim. Here I've got a photograph of how it was in the university in 1948. Just note how it has been simplified. The turret has gone, the windows, the side windows have gone, as Trondheim University tried to take it back to what the archaeological evidence showed was the original structure. Although the west door that they put in actually came from Ålen, a different Stave Church. And then this is where it is now in its latest location at Sverreborg in the university grounds. But we've got some more versions of Holtdalen. This one here is known as Holtdalen Nye Stavkirke, which was being built as part of the Millennium celebrations at Holt-Ålen, which is about 50 miles away, but with an ambulatory around it. And here, do you remember I talked about a school project? This is what they built in 2011, which was actually based on the Haltdalen Stave Church. And here, another version of it. This isn't even in Norway, this is in Iceland, which was a gift from Norway to commemorate the 1000th anniversary of Iceland's conversion to Christianity. This church was built at Lom, remember those experimental archaeologists, using material which had come from all over Norway and then transported to Iceland. And once again, note that this version has got an added ambulatory. I now want to turn to Øya, another pretty simple stave church. As you are driving along the road, you can see the new white wooden church that was built in 1871. And after they had built the new church, the timbers for the old church were actually stored under its floor. When repairs were being done to the new church in 1935, work found the forgotten remains of the Stave Church predecessor. And eventually the new church, a suitable location was found, and the Stave Church was then reconstructed between 1960 and 1965. So here we've got a photograph of it during its reconstruction early on. That photo dates from 1960. And this is how we saw Øya on our road trip in 2014. Completed from the 156 parts, but no drawing, so they had to work out how it was all going to fit together again. Here, I'm just looking at the portal. The portals had originally gone to the Cultural Museum in Oslo, but when they rebuilt the church, they actually came back from the museum and are now part of the structure. There's also an opening preserved in the nave floor. That's actually in the nave floor. I'm not sure which church it is now. But it's been theorized that this was the burial place for deceased infants and unborn embryos, so-called embryo packets, which were occasionally seen in other Norwegian churches. And not very good view of the interior. Unfortunately, we couldn't get in, but they've got a magnificent wooden font inside there. And now I want to look at the last of the churches which has been transported. This was in Vang. It is now in Poland. Here we can see it as it was drawn in 1841 by Johann Christian Dahl, who at the time was a professor at the Dresden Academy of Arts. It's quite clearly a simple building, but according to tradition, it was actually a rebuild from a more complex structure elsewhere. It was about to be demolished and the timbers auctioned off, a replacement church having been completed. But Johann Christian Dahl persuaded the vicar to put in a bid on his behalf, which he won, but he then had to clear the site of all the timbers by the end of the year. Dahl then persuaded the Crown Prince, later King Frederick William IV of Prussia, to take responsibility for the church and cover the costs of re-erecting it in Potsdam. Dahl's student, F.W. Schertz, conducted a survey of the church and directed the demolition process. Whoopsie, sorry, I went the wrong way. And here we've actually got a sketch by Schertz during the demolition. Most of the building parts were then transported over the mountains to Lierdal, and from there, an onward journey to Germany. This watercolor shows the chancel vault in Vang Stave Church, which arrived, we know it arrived in Berlin, but has since disappeared. We only know it now from Schertz's watercolors. here reproduced from a copy taken in 1897. And, well, words fail me when I'm looking at the detail there, even though that is just a copy of a copy. But the original plan was discarded in favour of a site at a remote village of Brückenberg in Silesia, which is now in Poland. The foundation stone was laid on August the 2nd, 1842, in the presence of now King Frederick William himself. It was a demanding task for carpenters who had never seen a stave church to rebuild it correctly. And in spite of the excellent drawings which had been made by Shearts, most of the materials were discarded. Only the main construction, consisting of the sill posts and the wall plates, were made use of, in addition to the carved door frames. And an external gallery was built with new materials. Every wall plank was replaced. And they presumed that there must have been an apse which had been lost, so they put one back on when they reconstructed the church. And the doorways were turned inside out, with the carvings now facing inwards as opposed to outwards. But wow, what carvings! And I just love the cats. At which point I say, to be concluded next week.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Loved every
Very
minute.
good.
Mike, could I ask you, what sort of timber was actually used? Or was it different timbers for different functions within the church?
It was almost entirely pine.
Pine.
Mm.
And then that would be for the delicate carvings as well, sort of everything.
Yes.
Mm.
Thank you.
And on the last slide,
Yeah.
what was it? A green man? That in your last picture, it looked like a green man.
Yeah.
Could well be.
Could well be. You actually find the green man motif in quite a number of places in Norway.
Mm. Mm.
Can I ask, why did they have so few windows? Was there a particular reason?
Cold weather.
Was it?
Weather.
Was it?
Weather, basically.
And glass was an incredibly expensive, almost unheard of commodity in Norway until pretty well Reformation times.
Mm.
Mm.
So,
And how do you account for the fact that some of the wood has survived since the 11th century and other pieces rot away? I mean, was it because it was inadequately prepared or what?
well, the whole method of stave construction, where essentially you've got a horizontal sill which prevents moisture wicking upwards, is one of the reasons why the woodwork has been preserved so well. The earlier post-construction churches, where everything was vertically into the ground and moisture would wick up and cause the timber to rot, they don't reckon that any post-constructed church could have lasted more than about 100 years.
Mm.
I think too, what I would say is that very often, where you get partial rot, very often it's when they saw the signs of rot, they would then retar. By which time, of course, rot had already set in those places. It would kill them, but that would be the incentive to say it's time we retard the church.
Just cover it up. Yeah.
Mm.
Mike, could I ask you about the Treaty of 1217, Norway, England? Was that a trade treaty?
Mm.
Yes,
Trade.
it It was the first ever trade
Ever.
treaty.
In the world.
Yes.
As far as we
Amazing.
know.
1217. Thank you. Thanks.
It seemed very straightforward as well. I mean, not like the EU and Brexit.
Oh, there.
Freedom
Good
from
point.
taxes and free movement of labour were two of the fundamental things in that
Yeah.
agreement.
Yes. Yes.
Although free movement of labour, one point which I didn't make on the historical timeline was the fact that 1066 saw not only the Normans replacing the Saxons in England, but also the death of King Harold of Norway and a power grab in Norway by the church.
Ah.
And starting in 1067, you see the first stone-built churches in Norway, and they were all made, the first stone-built churches in Norway were all done by Saxon stonemasons
Yes.
who were not going to exercise their craft under the Normans.
Right.
Similarly, the Varangian Guard in Byzantium suddenly becomes Anglo-Saxon as opposed to Viking.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxon
Amazing.
military got out and went to be paid by the Emperor of Byzantium instead.
Mm.
Amazing, quite interesting.
Let's go.
Could I refer back to the term Svalgang and the implication of movement? Compare our English word gangway.
Yep.
Yes,
Yes.
Well,
absolutely.
well,
Yes.
Ganger Rolf is the chap who walks. Rolf who moves around, who walks. Ganger is essentially to walk.
Yes, well, it comes from the
Ganger.
German. It's a Germanic language, so
Yeah.
it comes from the German.
Good.
But certainly in the Norwegian context, whenever you use the word gang, it always implies movement.
Yes.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. Yes. Oh.
And I'll be talking more next week about processions and the implications on the churches.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah.